at the University of Amsterdam, where she leads the dialogue modeling group. Her interests are in computational semantics and pragmatics in dialogue interaction and visually grounded language processing. Her PhD is from the King's College London, and she has held previous research positions in Potsdam and at Stanford University. She's currently the recipient of an ERC Consolidator grant and is, of course, an active member of our community, being part, for example, of the editorial board of the Computational Linguistics Journal, the standing reviewer for TACL, and chair of multiple community meetings. So Raquel, welcome, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Okay, thanks very much, Irina, for the nice introduction, and also for the invitation to speak at the workshop. I think it's great that we are having this ELLIS NLP workshops on a regular basis that allows the NLP community in Europe to meet from time to time, for now on a virtual basis, but maybe this might change. So I'm very happy to speak here today. So in this short talk, I would like to present to you some of the work that is currently going on in my research group, and which revolves around two related questions.
Raquel, you got muted.
Sorry about that.
We can't hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I don't know exactly where. Yeah, I hope this will work. Where you got cut. Let me just break up again. Okay. So I was saying that I would like to share with you some work that revolves around two related questions. So on the one hand, how can cognitive and also linguistic theories of human language processing inspire and help to drive forward NLP models? And then the other side of the same coin, how might neural AI models that we typically use in NLP nowadays also inform human language processing theories, in the sense of how can the successes of these models or the errors of these models feed back into human processing theories, right? So with the framework of these two questions, I look at these two questions from the point of view of pragmatics, very broadly understood. So my area of interest is language use in context, like what I understand as pragmatics. And this means basically that I tend to take into account the fact that language is typically used in communicative situations that involve both speakers and addressees. And these speakers and addressees, of course, have specific cognitive biases. They also have specific social characteristics, and they also have beliefs about each other, about the knowledge that they share, the common ground that they have, and the beliefs about what they don't share as well, right? And all this plays a role in language use. And of course, context can also be extra linguistic, right? In the sense of connecting language to the external world, and how we refer to aspects of the external world, and how we use other modalities in combination with language to make sense of language, right? And to influence how language is processed, right? So within this rather broad umbrella of language using context and pragmatics, in this talk today, I would like to focus specifically on production, right? And I would like to give you 3 examples of theories of human production mechanism, human production strategies, which I think can be useful, or they have the potential to inspire work on natural language generation, right? And and with the hope that maybe we can move forward from the type of regularities that are typically learned from more standard language models, right? So 3 types of phenomena and of theories of human language production that hopefully have something to say and about language generation, where we can get inspiration from it. And I'll start with cross-modal coordination, which has to do with multimodal language generation, generating from images and from language, generating language from images. Right. So when we talk about visual content, for example, when we describe a scene or when we describe an image, right, we obviously need to coordinate both language processing and visual processing, right? And how these two modalities and these two types of processing align and get coordinated is a complex question that has been investigated and is currently being investigated quite extensively among cognitive scientists, right? And also on the computational side. And when it comes to visual processing, the information that we can gather may come from gaze, from how we explore some visual stimulus, right? And this gaze can be captured using eye tracking mechanisms. Right? And the idea is that if we capture this gaze, this type of information, then provides us with a window into what processing goes on while we are exposed to certain stimuli, right? And this information about processing mechanisms going on while we are exposed to certain stimuli is not giving us only information on visual processing, but may also give us information about other types of processing, for example, about language processing itself, right? And so in NLP, gaze, human gaze, has been exploited in recent work quite a bit, and rather exciting work, I think. Right here you have a few references, including work by Barbara, where in this case, what is exploited is work from gaze as readers are reading text, right? So here we don't have, well, it's multimodal to some extent, but there is no vision stimulus. There is just reading text, and this and the data, the information that comes from gaze as humans read text can provide rather rich, can be a rich source of information for feeding into different NLP tasks, right? Different types of sequence classification tasks, also extractive tasks, and gaze has been exploited in rather original ways. Sometimes, for example, as a regularizer in multitask learning setups, and also as a way to providing additional input, right? So it's clear that this can be useful for having better NLP systems, right? But when it comes to, so as I said, this is not in the multimodal case, right? It's in the text-only case. If we move to the multimodal case where visual processing takes place actually on images, then we find work that that is usually done, well, within the computer vision community or within the vision and language computer vision plus NLP community, right? And in this case, when we are actually processing images as well, so gaze has been mostly exploited to learn patterns of human attention over images, right? So that means basically to learn saliency maps, like, for example, what we have here in this image here would be a possible saliency map that reflects the different fixations that possibly many speakers have exhibited while looking at this image or doing certain tasks with this image, right? Because I should point out that gaze patterns are actually task dependent, so they vary depending on what the speakers are being asked to do, right? But yeah, so in computer vision, when we have multimodal tasks and that include language generation, most commonly gaze data has been explored to learn these attention maps over images that are typically static for a given image and a given task in particular. What has been far less explored is the sequential nature of gaze, right? So the fact that there is not only some particular salience over an image that we can learn by looking at gaze patterns, but that during language production, for example, in the task of describing a certain scene, then gaze is also sequential, right? So both the language production problem and the gaze sequence problem as well are subject to the linearization problem, right? So both of them need to be linearized and are in sequence. So the question then is how these two types of processing, visual and linguistic processing that happen in parallel, actually align with each other. And I find this question very interesting, and it's a question that we started to study in a paper that we published last year at EMNLP. And yeah, so basically we were investigating how these two streams of information can be aligned in parallel when generating an image description, right? And so I will not tell you more about this work. I invite you to check it out. But basically what we were doing here was extending an existing image captioning system by including gaze data. In this case, the gaze data was giving us input. And then the main findings that we had from this work was that using gaze data led to linearizations in the image description that were more similar to those produced by humans, right, in terms of linearization. And also an additional finding was that encoding the sequence of gaze information in a dedicated recurring component led to slightly better results, which I think indicates that the alignment between the two modalities is not trivial at all. So that you need to have well, we still need to find out what is the best way of actually aligning these two modalities to predict better how the text should be generated, right? So I won't give you any more details. My point here was just to make the point that I think that exploiting this sequentiality of gaze when it comes to multimodal generation is something that is not yet quite taken into account, and that I think that there is both potential for improving multimodal language generation systems, and as well as potential for maybe feeding back into the still open questions that we find on the cognitive science side, right? And I don't know if you had the chance to attend Fernando Ferreira's keynote at EACL a few months back, which was about linearization in production, and which was a wonderful talk, I think, and then you will get an idea of what are the open questions there. And I think that this is maybe a topic where there can be interactions in both directions, like we can maybe gain things by exploiting ideas from cognitive science, and perhaps also feedback by proposing models that allow us to test different theories. All right, so this is the first example that I wanted to give you. I will now move on to the second one, which has to do with conversational grounding, right? Moving on, staying with multimodal settings, but moving on into aspects that involve conversation and dialogue, right? So when we are in conversation, then the production decisions that we make about what to say in particular situations don't rely only on aspects that might be driven by what we are looking at, which is what I was mentioning before. But on top of that, of course, there are other types of constraints or aspects that become very important. And one of them, well known, of course, is what's the common ground that has been established with our dialogue partners, right? So we rely on this specific context of the conversation and the stuff that has already been produced in the conversation to decide how to, for example, how to refer to something or how to say something, right? So staying again with referring to images or describing images, for example, we may have a dialogue between two participants, A and B here, and if they have to identify this image here and maybe identify it and distinguish it from other entities in the context or the images in the context, they may start by saying a white fuzzy dog with a wine glass. And then the dialogue may proceed. They may have to refer to the same entities again, right, which is common in conversation. And then we may refer to this image again as I see the wine glass dog. And finally, also, I don't have the wine glass dog, right? So this seems perfectly fine, right? In a different dialogue, two different participants may just choose to refer to this image in a different way, right? This may be driven by the context or by different lexical availabilities that they may have and so on. So they may say white dog sitting on something red, and then the dialogue may proceed. And then the other participant may say, yes, I have the dog on the red chair. And finally, again, white dog on the red chair, right? So these expressions that are used in these two dialogues, they seem quite appropriate in the sense that they point out to properties of this image that we can say are true of the image, right? But basically, I hope that you will agree with me that, for example, using the wine glass dog at the end of this dialogue would not be quite coherent, because even though it's true of the image, it doesn't quite agree with what has become common ground in the dialogue, right? So there is certain coherence in the dialogue that needs to be maintained, and that it's on top of what might be true of what we are describing. Okay. So this is a bit the phenomenon that I want to mention, right? This idea, and there are like conversational grounding theories that will tell us that what we decide to say, how we decide to say it, heavily relies on what has been established as common ground. So these examples that I'm showing you here come from a data set that we created some time ago, which is the photo book data set. And it's a dialogue data set where two participants are chatting to each other to figure out which images they have in common. Each of them has a set of images, and they have to communicate by a chat interface to figure this out. So here you see a little dialogue where participant A is then able to take this image as being in common between the two participants, right? And this game consists of 5 rounds. This would be round 1. And the particularity that it has is that some images may reappear. So basically this provides a setup where participants may have to refer again to the same images, right? And we created this to elicit this referring to the same images, which is something that in fact happens in natural dialogue, but it's a bit difficult to obtain when you are trying to crowdsource, right? So by looking at the different referring utterances that have been used for a given images within a dialogue between two specific participants, we can extract what we call referring utterance chains. So here you would see a chain similar to the ones by the dog, about the dog that I showed you before. Different referring utterances that have been used within a dialogue to refer to a specific image. Each of them uttered in a slightly different visual context, right? So the image has to be distinguished from other distractors that are present in the context. And yeah, so the data set includes a bunch of these referring utterance chains, and therefore provides some rich data to investigate what happens in this chain. So how speakers refer to the same images in a dialogue, and also to try to model how we might be able to generate utterances that reflect these patterns. So I want to give you a bit of a quick glance of what are the patterns that we observe in this data, in these referring chains, in these referring utterance chains. And what we see basically replicates earlier findings, right? There's nothing very new here. This has already been observed in early psycholinguistic experiments done in the lab, but basically we are replicating this with a large scale experiment by a crowdsourcing, which was not a very small thing to do. So what happens here when people refer in the dialogue to the same entities? What we see is that there is a tendency to shorten the referring utterances, right? So they become shorter as they presumably as the speakers are able to rely more on the common ground that has already been established, right? As the utterances become shorter and more compressed, what we see is that there is an increase in the proportion of content words. So what tends to get dropped are mostly function words, right? So some determiners, some adpositions, etc. And content words are the ones that remain the most. In this particular domain, maybe because this is a very visual domain, the ones that mostly stay, so the proportion of part of speech that remain mostly, that increase, are nouns and adjectives mostly, while other types of content words, and as I said, the function words, tend to decrease in proportion as the dialogue proceeds. And then finally, what we also see is that the ratio of new content words introduced in these referring utterances decreases very drastically, which we understand as reflecting the phenomenon of lexical entrainment. So basically, if initially we have referred to a dog with a glass of wine and so on, then we stick to this type of terms. We entrain lexically with this type of terms, and will not tend to introduce other content words like red chair, even though that might be very true of that image. Okay. So these are the patterns that we observe in the data. And now, if we want to be able to have generation systems that mimic a bit these patterns, which I hope that's one of our goals, then one question that comes up is what kind of context encoding mechanisms would support these patterns in generation? what do we need to account for to actually be able to generate in this manner, right? And not to ignore dialogue context and so on. And of course, there are several possibilities, and I think that we're still looking for the best possible option, right? So one possibility, which was put forward by Robert Hawkins and colleagues last year at Cornell, was to consider that maybe the way to go would be to adapt to the dialogue partner, or to adapt to what has happened in the dialogue by fine-tuning the model as we go along. Right, so that we are more likely to produce language that is more similar to what has happened before. And that's indeed one possibility. There are several issues with it, but I think there are several issues with all the possibilities that we have available at our disposal right now. Another possibility, which is the one that we decided to explore, would be to rely on sort of episodic memory traces, and I'm using here the terminology by Horton and colleagues, right? To condition generation. So to think in terms of what has also sometimes been called reference diaries, right? So the idea that we keep in memory what has been said before about certain entities, and possibly also with what particular dialogue partner we have employed, that type of language, right? And that these memory traces then influence how we will re-refer to that entity as well. So we try to operationalize this particular theoretical take here in a paper that was also published at the MNLP last year. And basically you see a bit of a scheme of the model here. So with our encoder, we arrive at a multimodal representation that takes into account the visual context as well as the target image, and in this case, just the previous referring utterance that has been used in the dialogue and that has been effective, right? And then once we have this multimodal representation, there is an attention mechanism over this multimodal representation, and then from here we generate the next referring utterance for that target, right? So what we see with this type of model is that when we condition generation in this way by using both the visual context and this memory that we assume is available from the conversational context, that what we generate reproduces significantly better the linguistic patterns that I just told you about, right? Besides also being better according to more standard language generation metrics like CIDR or BERT score and so on. So this is just one possible take. As I said, there are quite a few open questions on what's the best way to adapt the language to reflect what is being said in an ongoing conversation, and how to best reproduce what we see in humans. And I think there is still quite a few of questions, but yeah, again, I just wanted to point out that this is one aspect where I don't think that our standard language models are still giving us a solution. So I think we need to look a little bit forward, a little bit beyond that. All right, and I want to now move to the third example. It will also be a very brief take, but I still wanted to point out to you, and hopefully this will give you some food for thought. And the last type of example of a theory of human language production that I think can be useful has to do with what has been called the entropy rate constancy principle, also the uniform information density principle, which are slightly different, but also very similar. So I'm just summarizing here the two of them in one take. And the idea here is that building on information theory is that rational speakers will tend to transmit information at a constant rate, at a rate that is constant given information content and information density, right? So distributing this information uniformly across the linguistic signal as they are planning this linguistic signal. And so these principles have traditionally been formulated in terms of information content and information density, expressed here in this formula, which basically is telling us that in context information density, so the information density of some linguistic unit in context is equivalent to the out of context information density, that would be like the surprisal of this linguistic unit, minus the mutual information between that linguistic unit and the context informativeness, right? And the idea is that as a discourse or a dialogue or a sentence even proceeds, right, as it is being produced, then the out of context information density of a unit will increase. Think about the reference chains that I just showed you, right? So towards the end of a chain, we have things that are quite surprising if they are produced out of context, right? Like the wine glass dog, for example. Right? However, in the context, that's not so surprising because we rely on the context. So surprisal increases out of context, but the level of dependency with respect to the context also increases as more context is available. And therefore, this makes the in-context information density stay constant according to the theory anyways, okay? So this is a rather intriguing theory that has been exploited quite a bit to explain different aspects of language production. And there is very interesting recent work by Clara Meister and Ryan Cottrell and colleagues as well, which has taken inspiration from this type of theory, from uniform information density theory, to try to improve our language models. For example, to use this theory, a particular operationalization of it, to use it as a regularizer in a language model, right? Another aspect that is also still an open question is to what extent actually the theory is empirically adequate for different types of data, for example, right? And I would like to invite you to go to the poster after this session to check the poster that Mario Giulianelli will present, which has to do with this aspect, right? So there are quite a few simplifications that have been put out there on how to calculate the different estimates, how to estimate the different quantities in this formula, which now we might be able to estimate more appropriately with current neural language models, and which would allow us to figure out what's the coverage and adequacy of this theory and perhaps adapt it if that's needed. And then again, feedback to our current language models with aspects that can help to improve them. Okay, I'm gonna finish here. I hope that you found some inspiration in these three examples of aspects related to human language processing that I think can provide some input to language generation. And I hope this gives you an idea of what this research program is about. And I'm looking forward to hear your thoughts if you have any. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Raquel, for this wonderful talk. I already have 2 questions from Bonnie for you. So question 1 is, sorry, it has disappeared because more question were input. Need to go back. So if function words disappear with increased chain position, so that's question 1. And the second is what happens in language in which function words are affixed morphemes?
Okay, that's a good question. So indeed, function words tend to disappear. I mean, so the ratio of function words tends to decrease, right? So there is an increase of content words, the proportion of content words. So indeed, they tend to disappear. So we often see these compounds, right? Like wine glass dog, this like nice 3-noun compound. And yeah, they tend to disappear. What would happen then with language in which the morphology puts together functional language? That's a good question. I mean, I wonder, right? So in English, we see these particular mechanisms of compression that might very well be language dependent, right? So in other words that, in other languages where there are different types of mechanisms and different constraints on what can be dropped and what can not be dropped, then we are likely to see different patterns. And it would be really interesting to see how this differs cross-linguistically.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Christos. So you can talk about this during poster session possibly. So Christos is asking, most of the theoretical results come from spoken language. Do you think there are differences in written language? that would be interesting to examine, especially for training large-scale language models? Should we be using spoken language in their training?
Okay, yeah, these are big questions. Well, I think, so it's true that when these aspects are investigated in the lab, typically we use spoken language because that's actually our most natural way of using language. I should point out that in the case of this dialogue data that I showed you, this photo book data set, this is written language, and it was also a good signal to see that we could see a reproduction of the same patterns that had been observed for spoken language in written language. So if that tells you something, that I think that this kind of generalizes to written language. Whether we should train our models on spoken language, well, I think that we all know that the more type of sources that we train our language models on, like multimodality, spoken, might lead to more robust and knowledgeable models. So let's say, yeah, in general terms, the more the better, the more type of data, the better. But I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what also Thomas would think about this, right? How feasible it is.
It's a great question for the closing discussion today.
Indeed.
Thank you. So the next question is from Mike Zhang. I have a question regarding conversational grounding. Reaching common ground could be vastly different between online chat and a physical conversation, as you mentioned. With a photo book data set, if you didn't have the limitations of crowdsourcing physical conversations, what would you expect to differ in terms of patterns as opposed to online chat? And how would this influence the model? Second, was there any heavy pre-processing involved in cleaning the chat conversations, as some people like to use utterances during an online chat, like, oh.
Okay, so the first question, I'm not sure I completely got it. So you mean, what do we expect that would change in the linguistic patterns observed if this was a kind of face-to-face conversation? So if that's the question, I would hope, yeah, okay, I see that that's the question, right? So I would hope that the key features of the patterns that I pointed out with this bunch of plots would not really change much, right? And okay, I don't have direct evidence to support this, but maybe you can try to do a bit of introspection of how language is being used. I think that these patterns of really compressing things and establishing some sort of pact with someone that we regularly talk to, I think that this is something very common that we have all experienced, right? And I think that this would not change. So the original experiments in the lab, well, there are many conditions that have been tested, but definitely there were conditions where people were face-to-face. So of course, every type of communication, like what are the properties of the communication, whether we see each other, whether we can give feedback immediately, or there is a delay in the responses or not, all these factors play a role on what kind of language we will use, right? And we will try to adapt to those constraints. So things might change slightly. But I have the impression that the core patterns that I presented here are very general and would hold, right? Now, about cleaning the data set. We did not clean the data set much, right? So we removed offensive words. We kind of masked, covered up offensive words. But other than that, we didn't remove anything. And if I remember correctly, the instructions that were given to the workers, to the crowdsourcing workers, were to try to use English, right, and to try to use standard language. I don't recall exactly how I framed it, but this was the idea. So I think it comes across as pretty natural and quite understandable.
Thank you. So one last question. Super interesting talk. Thank you. It's from Max Müller-Eberstein. Since multimodal data sets will likely always be rarer than single modality data, do you think the multimodal model's generalization ability will outweigh this training data sparsity? Or should we also focus on approaches integrating single modality data into the multimodal models?
Let me reread a bit. Well, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what to say. I don't have a very strong opinion on, well, yeah, very strong idea of which of these possibilities that you are pointing out might be better, right? I might not be the best person to answer this question. So my motivation for looking into these aspects is that I have the impression that we are just missing out on these very interesting things, in my view, if we are only training on large amounts of large amounts of text and trying to get the kind of co-occurrences patterns that we can get from that, right? So my motivation is really to point out that there are many factors that influence language use that are not being captured in that way, and that we should not forget these aspects because they can give us some clues about what we can improve. Whether the solution is in more multimodality training, like we were mentioning before, or on trying to somehow, like you mentioned at the end, integrate single modality data into multimodal models. I don't have strong opinions. I would love to hear your own opinions because I have the impression that you seem to have some.
So I think that's a lovely topic for the next papers to explore. Thank you very much for this discussion, Raquel.